tutorials. Today we're going to be looking at materials and texturing in Autodesk Mudbox 2015. So first I want to start off by saying that I'm going to be doing two videos for texturing. One is going to be this video, which is going to be texturing and materials of objects that are already within Mudbox, and the other video is going to be bringing in objects from other software. I'm going to be doing 3D Studio Max since that's what I will typically be using, but it will be taking objects that we've created in 3D Studio Max and importing them into Mudbox, and how we work with our textures and stuff there, which will be relatively a short video compared to this one, which will be a little bit more thorough. So what I want to start off with is first talking about working with multiple objects in Mudbox. So let's say we start out here. By the way, if you haven't seen the previous video where I go over the introduction, you may want to watch that one first, as I'm not going to be explaining some things like moving around the viewport and things of that nature. So what I want to talk about first is, if we start off with this basic head, at some point we're probably going to want to add spheres for eyes. And so to do that, we could come over to Create, Mesh, and come down to Sphere. And you'll see the spheres put in here. If we come over to the object list, we can see, if we pull this down, Sphere and Basic Head. So if we come down to the sphere, I'm going to go to Select and Move, and I'm just going to move this object out of the way here along the X value. And then I'll use Scale. I'm going to scale down from the center here. So I'm not going to end up sculpting the eye or anything like that, but what I want to show is currently in our object list we have one default material, and that's actually being applied to both of these. And I'll show you why this is important in just a moment. Let me deselect this over here. Just select that. So one of the things that we can do is, if we have this default material and I select it, we can see that it has this kind of diffuse base color here, and whatever color we end up making that will change the color here. So you can kind of see how that works. And this is going to be our default color, so we're really going to be painting over top of this. So I'm just going to set mine to white for now, for that. And then if you want to have specularity or not, you can always turn that off and it'll get rid of the shininess on there. If I make it white, I'll have a lot of specularity. So I'm just going to set that to black as well. And we'll talk about materials a little bit more in a moment. But I want to walk through some of the different paint tools that we have here. And I'm just going to grab this and drag it over so we can see all of the paint tools at once. So starting off, whenever I go to the paintbrush, we can see the paintbrush pops up here. I'm going to bring my tabs here to the paint tab so we can see that. By default it will normally say sculpt, but we've clicked paint down here and paint over here. Currently there are no layers over here either, so layers are going to be very important, obviously. So with my paintbrush, I'm going to use the same buttons here as I did with the sculpting video that I had done, where if I hit the right bracket I can make my brush size bigger, and we can see the brush size here changing as well. And if I hit the left bracket key, I can make it get smaller. And then down below there on your keyboard you'll see you have the colon and quotation, and those will change the strength, or in this case the opacity of our brush. And if I hit the colon, I'll make it smaller, and if I hit the quotation, I'll make it larger, or I'll make the strength higher. Down below here we have the same idea, our mirror plane. So for that I'm going to just mirror along the x-axis here. So there's our x, so whatever I do on one side will work on the other. Pretty typical stuff there. Over here on the right we also have our color that we're going to use. So I might start with, and I know this will seem silly, but I'm going to flood this paint layer, and I'm going to create this as my base color, my diffuse. So I'm just going to simply just write in base color layer, The size of the image, I'm going to just keep it at 1024. You can go up to 2048. This is pixels, by the way, in case you're not aware. And then 4096 is the highest one that you can currently do. I always save mine out as target files just because I prefer target files. You can see there are a number of different file types here. Target works fine for me. And then under here we have different map channels. So this one will be set to our diffuse channel. You can paint in our specular, gloss, incandescence, opacity, and those are the ones we're really going to cover in this tutorial. So just starting out with diffuse, change my writing there, base color. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and flood this paint layer, and I'm just flooding it white for now. I know that my base texture was already white, but if I wanted to go with something for this character's flesh tone and flood it, I could do that as well. Now notice whatever I change on here changes on this, and that also goes for painting. So if I come up here and I change this to black, and we can either use the color wheel and the gradient here, or some of the presets will be saved here, or we can use the ones up above. You can see how those work. So I'm just going to set that to black and say done. Okay, so now what I want you to notice is, oops, looks like I've got some options here currently turned on that I want to turn off. There we go. Okay, I just want to see what my fall off is set to, and make sure my stamps are turned off. Okay, sorry about that. And I'm going to turn my strength all the way up. So what you'll be able to see is if I'm drawing on here, it's going to update on this object. And if you're doing an eye, that might not be something you want, especially if you were coming over here and you're like, yeah, I want to make this look like an eye. I'm going to hit W to turn on my wireframe, and that way I can just see where the center of this is. Make this a little larger. Okay, so let's say I'm like, yeah, that's where I want my eye to be. I come back here and I see I got a big black mark here, there, one on top of his head maybe. Where's the other one? Oh, down here on the shoulder. So the reason being is these are sharing the same material. So the first thing that we need to be able to do is create our own materials. We do have some material presets here. I'll pull this over so you can see those. So we have material presets, but that's not what I'm talking about. So what I want to do is I actually want to right click on the eye and say assign new material, Mudbox material, and I'm going to call this eye, and I'll set the diffuse color to just white, and I'll say done, and I can just close that. So now they have two separate materials on them. So when I texture on one, now it's going to want a material layer for this. I'm going to cancel there. I can also create layers directly from here. So I can just click new layer. I can name this, so I could call this eye base, base color. And now whenever I paint on here, we can see how that looks. And if I come to my UVs here, I can see where that's been painted on the coordinate system. Same idea, if I paint on the face here, that's going to update too, showing the coordinate system for the UVs. So I'm going to come back to color. I'm going to select that flesh tone again, and I'm going to flood just to fill that back in. I'm going to hit W to turn off the wireframes. So one thing I like to do sometimes while I'm texturing, if I'm trying to see what I'm painting really well, and I'm going to turn the grid off here just so we don't see that, is if I'm painting, you can see how there's shadow from the lighting in the scene here. So what I can do under display is say flat lighting, and this, while difficult to look at here, it allows me to look at my paint layers as just how they would look without any lighting affecting them. So it's something that we can come back to from time to time to look at. Okay, so our diffuse layers basically going to be there to handle our base colors, or our skin textures and things like that. Give him some thick. There we go. He looks great. And he's got his own eyes. But there's a frowny face. Oh, kind of looks like Abe Lincoln. But mainly I wanted you to see that you're able to texture on here, and you're able to texture on here if we assign different materials. When we come into the object list here, you can see there's one now called eye and one called default material, which we could rename to head. Doesn't matter. Okay, so that basically covers just assigning different materials. There are some starting materials that you can use here. So if you had the eye selected, I just clicked on it to select it. I could change this if I want it to be more like this red glossy material. And if I come over here now, I can see that the eye has taken on these new settings. So I could, the diffuse right now is using a map, that's why we don't see the color there. But I'm just going to set that back to just white. And so you can see that update. So talking about some of the other map channel types that we have here, and I'll just focus on the eye for now just because it'll be good to show some of these. So I can do a new layer, and I'm going to set this as my specular layer, so I'll just name this specular base. Glad I left my ringtone on. Shut that off now so we don't have to deal with that. Okay, specular base, and I'm going to say OK, and by default there's nothing currently in this layer, so I'm going to come back to the paintbrush and I am going to flood it with white just so you can see what this will look like differently. So I'm going to flood the paint layer. Oh, great. I didn't realize I had the head selected when I did that. Okay, well I guess this is going to go on the head. Wait, what? Specular flood paint layer. Why is it doing that? Alright, so I'm just going to turn the head off here and make sure that my sphere is the active object here. So it currently is. I'm just deselecting it there. It should remain active over here. Alright, so let's try this again. Flood paint layer. There we go. So now we can see we have a specularity here. Now based on what level of white or black we have here depends on what the specularity will look like. So in this case, white represents 100% specularity. So we have specularity and we have gloss, and the difference between those are specularity is basically saying that we're allowing an object to have a specularity. We're allowing it to be a shiny object. And basically if it's painted black, that would mean that it's not allowing specularity. So if I go ahead and I just go to black, and I'm just going to make a black, or a kind of a dot on here real quick. So we can see now that area is no longer shiny. Okay, and if I come back and I fill this with, actually let's do the whole thing black, and I'll flood it. And what I'm going to do is take different levels of gray. So I'm going to step up a little bit, and I'm just going to put dots on here. So, and let me flood the base color here with something a little more neutral, just so we can see this kind of showing all over here. So I'm going to flood that. I'm going to come back to my specularity layer, and that should be flooded with black right now. So I'm going to take my paintbrush with gray. Okay, so I just put a little bit of this gray in the specularity layer. I'm going to come up a little bit more. I'm going to go right next to this, and then I'll come all the way up to white. Okay, so basically you can see that each one has a different level of specular. So we can see this one is like a hot bright white, and then it's kind of a fuzzier, not as harsh edges. specularity, and then an even more kind of foggy or blurry specularity. Now we get into gloss. So I'm just going to go ahead and name this gloss. Okay, so this is going to work off the same principle. Whereas black, so if I flood this with black, I get very harsh shines on here. Okay, and if I now come in and I fill this with white, it's going to come right through here, and so we can see we have a very hot, small, shiny spot. It's a little more blurry and a lot more blurry. And we can kind of see how that reacts. And then as we get out of the specularity areas, that's where we don't see any specularity. So specularity controls whether or not we're allowed to have specularity. Gloss tells us how much is this like high polish, whereas this is more of a high polished stone we might have, and this would be more like a dull glass or something like that. So if I come into specularity and I'm going to simply flood this just so we can see this all together, and I'm going to come into gloss and I'm going to flood that the same. Okay, so we can see what our gloss looks like there. So everything here is at the same specularity level. Actually, I'll go ahead and flood this white. So this tells me that the entire object is allowed to be 100% fully specular and have a very hot, very sort of harsh edge here. And so I'm going to flood this black. Okay. And so this is basically making the hot spot fall over the entire object. And as I come up from there, I'm just going to leave that open. So you can see what that looks like compared to if I make this fully white. It gets a lot smaller. So hopefully that gives you some sort of idea there. Okay, and I'm going to turn off specularity and gloss. Okay, so next down from there is incandescence. So incandescence is the ability to have light given off from the surface. So I'll just call this glow. So in this case, let's say I wanted to have this fiery red area kind of painted on here. Okay, so as I paint that on, I'm going to go ahead and move my light. So I'm going to hit the L key and I'm going to left click and drag. So what that's going to do is it's going to allow me to move my light around. And so I'm going to move my light all the way around to where this side's in shadow, or at least mostly in shadow. So you can see, even though this is in shadow, it remains lit. So that's what incandescence allows us to do. If we had, if we were doing a suit for like the movie Tron, and we wanted to have the parts of the suit really light up and have like electricity or light given off from it, this is what incandescence would be used for. So we can just see what that looks like. I'm going to go ahead and turn that one off, and just reset my light here. You can just hold L and right click, or right click and drag, or L and then just move your light where you want it. Okay, down from there, our final one is going to, that we're covering, is opacity. Opacity. Okay, so opacity allows us to paint whether or not this object is opaque or transparent or somewhere in between. And all of these work off a black and white value, where white equals basically yes and black equals no. So I'm going to fill this with white, because by default there's nothing in this. So if I want to use this, it's best if I start off basically where I want it to be. So I'm going to flood the air, the entire thing white. And like I said before, it was an empty layer, so we're actually giving it some sort of information. So now if I go into black and I use my paintbrush here, I can paint out a section here so we can see that this is now see-through. Now we don't see the inside of this because by default our show both sides is turned off. If I turn that back on, then we can see the other side of our mesh here. So if I continue to paint this out, you can see that. And that's how that works. And that's like the very basics of these map channels. You can really just go a little bit further from there, but just to give you an idea, I'm going to go ahead and turn off display both sides just to save on computer power, and I'll go ahead and turn off opacity map. So now I'm basically just going to cover our diffuse map and what we can do with these different tools and some of these different settings over here. So back to my eye base mesh here. So we've already seen that we can, paint whatever we're going to paint on here. And if I have, why is mirror not turned on for this? Oh, it's because the object is off to the side, because I've moved it over. If we remember our previous object, our head, which actually I'm just going to delete our sphere and that material, and I'll just turn my base head back on and work from there. So I can hit the A key to, since this is selected, it just frames my selection, lets me see what I had selected. So we can see whatever I do on one side, it's going to do on the other side. Our different stamps allow us to, I'm going to make my brush bigger here, but it allows me to stamp whatever this image is here on here. If I set my stamp spacing here further apart, you can kind of see what that looks like. That looks like I've got some randomize turned on here. Yeah, I do. Okay. So we can kind of see what that looks like. I'm just undoing Control Z. So the other thing is, if this is set on white, and I grab one of these stamps that have color in them, I'm going to use that color. But if I use a color from here, this color is actually going to overlay this map. So as I paint it, it's going to use the black and white values and add this red to it. So we can see what that looks like. So that's the stamps. I'm going to go ahead and just flood this back to white. Or actually, I'll just undo. Okay. On the other hand, we have the stencils. So the stencils in this case, there's one here for, I believe, grass. And so we can see this grass is overlaid here. We can see our stencil settings, or this little note here for our stencil. Basically, we can use the S key, and we can middle mouse, click and drag to move this around. I like where it's at, so I'm going to leave it there. I can S and right click to change the size, and then S and left click and drag to rotate this. And then basically whatever color I have here, it's going to paint what I'm currently looking at on this. And okay, I just want to make sure it wasn't inverting. And that's something you can do though if you set it to invert values. You can kind of see what that ends up looking like. So it's just taking this stencil and putting it down so I can texture this directly on it. And I'm mirroring right now, so it's going to do on the other side whatever I do on this side. Okay, so those are stencils. You can load in other images here, so I can do a head stencil. And this is a thing that I had from creating this little Doctor Who thing that I used as a stencil. But I'll go to my pictures. I'm sure I got all kinds of crazy weird stuff in here. Let's see. There we go. Better not use that. It's a copywritten image. Okay, so this is from a wood burning that I've done, so I'll use it. So that image will be put down here. I can see it there. And then I could like take the character's face and line it up to this. And somewhere around there, I don't know. Probably want to turn off mirror for this. Let me turn off invert also, and I'll set my paint color here to black. Actually, invert would have looked better. And then even if I go in and I turn off mirror, and then I'll turn the stencil off. You can see what that looks like. It's kind of weird with the black lines going through the eyes, but so you can see what that looks like. This would be really good if I had some sort of image that maybe I wanted to sculpt on this character, and I wanted to just lay this on here as kind of a stencil to work with, which is why it's called stencil. It's really weird looking, but that's basically what we can do with those. So I'm going to go ahead and undo that. Turn my stencil off, turn my stamps off, and then finally we have our fall off, and that works very much the same way as when we're sculpting. So this is our default. It has this ease out and ease in of our brush. So if I just come here down the middle, let me change my stamp spacing here again, and again we can use steady stroke like before that we learned in the other video. That allows us to make just very nice straight lines. So steady stroke. But I'm just going to draw this down here just so we can see the difference between some of these. Some of them may not look too different because of my fall off. Let me change my strength here. I'll just turn this to like 50%. And it basically just determines how much it's filling out. So this one has a lot of a softer edge to it, whereas if I go to this very obtuse one, it's almost a very solid line, whereas this one will be completely solid. And you can see you get that those sort of edges on it. We have a projection, which this brush is designed to work with a stencil, so we'd have to have a stencil turned on. In this case, it's going to take the color as well, though I have to have my projection set to white. Oh, the stamp is still on. Okay. Fall off. Okay, stencil. Oh, we're using the invert. Still. There we go. So this will allow me to put this grass directly on here. So that's what projection is good for. And it also works the same way as before, as if we have a color in here, it's going to use that color instead. So you can see how that works. Go ahead and turn that stencil off. I'm going to leave this here for now. We have our eyedropper, which will allow us to select a color from here. So that color will be put as active, and it will apply it to whatever brush we were just using. So eyedropper, red, now red is put in here. You can just simply use the eyedropper here, so this is kind of pointless. A lot of times with these tools, whenever there's a tool I don't use a lot, I can middle mouse click on it, just drag it all the way to the end, or you can even no, you can just drag it to the end. So if there's something I'm not using, you know, I can put it here to where I can't see it. Airbrush. So I'll just select, let's use this green. And so this works like you might imagine. So it just kind of builds up on itself, whereas the other one is a very harsh, sort of heavy line to it. Set this to more of a soft fall off, so we're not getting that ring there. So you can kind of see what that looks like. If I turn my strength up higher, I get kind of the same idea. A lot of these, just like with the sculpting tools, they're set at defaults that work very well for them. This one also, since it is doing an airbrush, if you see here with my paintbrush, no matter how fast I drag here, it's going to draw on there, where the airbrush actually will skip around. So the faster I go, the more this will kind of skip. And then we have the pencil, which does kind of work very much like the brush. If you highlight over this, it's, yeah, it's basically set up to draw, what do they say here? Thin lines, right? So, I don't know. I never really use this. I don't really see the point. I mean, maybe if I had this one set up to have steady stroke on, and then I would default to using this for this particular thing, so I don't have to keep changing my brush settings here. It might be a good thing for it. Erase, I mean, that's going to be pretty simple. It allows us to erase. And right now my strength on it's set pretty low. So, erase. Clone, it's our typical clone stamp. Hold Control key to choose a sample point. So I can click here and then paint whatever I see on here. So, again, fairly simple. The dry brush is kind of a cool tool. I'm going to subdivide this mesh, so I'm going to hit Shift D a couple of times, and we'll stop it there. And I'm going to flood the paint layer real quick just to give me a simple base color. So I'll go back to this kind of Caucasian flesh tone, sort of. And if I hit W, I can see that I've subdivided and I've added a lot of polygons here. So the reason I'm doing it is I'm going to just sculpt in really quick some simple details. And I'm just going to kind of go over the same area to create areas that are really pushed in. I'll turn my strength up a bit. And then I'll smooth this out a little bit. Whoa. I smoothed that way more than I meant. That would be why. Okay. So I come back to my paint brush and I do this dry brush. The idea behind the dry brush is it's like if you're painting with an actual dry brush, and that means that you're normally, if you're using a dry brush, maybe not getting into the deep crevices of an area. Let me turn my strength up. Okay, strength is up. Let's see here. Okay, so as I go over this, you can see it's not really getting down into those deep areas. And with any of these tools, if I hold Control, I'm going to do just the opposite. So now I can paint in the deep areas without getting the raised areas. And so you can see how that works. So that's pretty neat. Blur, I mean, shouldn't have to explain too much here. It blurs. I'll change my brush size here. Okay, so we can see it blurs. Okay, dodge. Dodge will should lighten. Change our strength here. So each time we go over it, it's going to lighten that area. Burn will darken. Strength. So every time we go over with the burn tool, we'll darken that area. Contrast allows us to change our contrast. So you can see it's going to make our light colors lighter, dark colors darker. Sponge is going to basically desaturate. It's going to remove color. So as we go over that, you can see these are now going to more grays. If I flood it, I just keep doing that, it'll remove all the color from that side. I'm doing flood from camera here, so you can see it's only doing what the camera could currently see. Then we have hue. So I can paint this red hue over what I have here. There's no color here, so it's not going to do anything there, but it will change the areas over here that are not desaturated. Let me turn this back to wireframe off. Okay, color shift will allow me to take whatever colors I have here and shift them 30 degrees. So in the case of the red, this should become either more orange or more yellow. So more yellow here. This would be good if you wanted to add a little bit of color variation. So I could set this to something very small like 1. And if I was painting an area, I could kind of slowly change it. Let's go a little bit higher here. And so you can see we're just barely changing our colors here as we go over it. So our green's becoming more cyan, our blue is becoming more blue, and our dark blue is becoming more purple to magenta. And as you just keep going over an area, it's just going to keep shifting through those colors. Okay, so that's color shift. Invert will take and paint the opposite of what we have. So it'll invert it. And then we get back to the eyedropper. So those are all of the tools that we have. The other thing is we can create different layers. So if I create a new diffuse layer on top of here, maybe I call this, we'll just call it burn. And I'm just going to come in with a this kind of orangey brown auburn color and just paint that in. You can see if I go to color burn, it's going to color burn that. If I go to multiply, it's going to darken it and keep that brown color in there. And so you can kind of mess with different layers just like you would in Photoshop. Kind of the same idea. Many of them are the same. But I think that kind of concludes this tutorial. If there's anything that's unclear or anything that you maybe need to see a little bit further, please leave a comment. Like I said, I will be doing a second video where we take objects that we're taking from 3D Studio Max and bringing them into Mudbox, and that way we can see how we can sculpt those things, but also checking that the textures and the UVs and everything are coming through properly. So hopefully you found this video to be informative and it's helped you out. If so, please give me a like, leave me some comments, let me know what else you would like to see in the future. So Thank you for watching, and please like, subscribe, and comment.